They chose Independence Day for a reason. While families across Texas gathered for barbecues and fireworks, while children waved sparklers and couples spread blankets under the stars, a group of individuals drove toward the ICE detention facility in Alvarado with body armor strapped to their chests, firearms loaded, and radios crackling with coordinated instructions. The fireworks that night would serve a different purpose. Not celebration. Diversion, and when the first explosion lit up the sky near the facility's perimeter, guards initially thought it was just another patriotic display. They were wrong. By the time they realized the truth, the attack had already begun. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this. The Alvarado ICE Facility sits on the outskirts of a small Texas town, a place where everyone knows everyone, where the biggest news is usually about high school football or the county fair. It's the kind of community where people still leave their doors unlocked, where trust is assumed rather than earned. The detention center itself is unremarkable from the outside, a low-slung complex of buildings surrounded by fencing, security cameras, and floodlights. Inside, it houses individuals awaiting immigration proceedings, a bureaucratic holding pattern that can last weeks or months. To most residents of Alvarado, the facility is simply part of the landscape, barely noticed, rarely discussed. But to certain individuals, it represented something else entirely, a symbol, a target, an embodiment of everything they believed was wrong with the system. Understanding what happened on July 4, 2025, requires understanding how ordinary people transform into attackers. How ideology, when left to ferment in the right conditions, becomes action. How thoughts become plans, and plans become violence. The individuals who drove toward that facility that night didn't wake up one morning and decide to launch an assault. Their radicalization was a process, a gradual descent into a worldview where violence wasn't just justified but necessary. The psychological journey from concerned citizen to armed attacker follows predictable patterns that law enforcement and psychologists have documented across ideological spectrums. It begins with grievance. A sense that something in the world is fundamentally wrong, unjust, intolerable. For the Alvarado attackers, that grievance centered on immigration enforcement, on the very existence of detention facilities, on what they perceived as systemic cruelty embedded in government policy. In the months leading up to the attack, investigators would later discover several of the participants had immersed themselves in online communities where anti-ICE sentiment wasn't just expressed but amplified, radicalized, weaponized. These weren't mainstream political forums. These were spaces where the language shifted from protest to resistance, from resistance to direct action, from direct action to violence. The documents found in their possession after the attack revealed a worldview where compromise was betrayal, where peaceful protest was performative weakness, where only dramatic action could create change. Would you have noticed the warning signs if you knew these individuals? Would their social media posts have seemed concerning or just passionate? The psychology of group radicalization differs significantly from individual radicalization. When people radicalize alone, there's often hesitation, second-guessing, the internal voice that questions whether extreme action is truly justified. But when radicalization occurs within a group, those doubts are systematically dismantled. The group becomes an echo chamber where the most extreme voices are celebrated, where hesitation is mocked, where commitment to the cause is measured by willingness to act. Each member reinforces the other's beliefs, creating a feedback loop that pushes everyone toward increasingly radical positions. The Alvarado attackers didn't just share an ideology, they shared a plan. And that plan required coordination, preparation, and a chilling level of commitment. The acquisition of body armor tells us something crucial about their mindset. Body armor isn't something you purchase on impulse. It's expensive, specialized, and its very existence in someone's possession indicates premeditation. These individuals expected resistance, they expected gunfire. They expected a confrontation where their survival would depend on protection. This wasn't a spontaneous protest that escalated. This was a military-style operation planned with the expectation of violence. The firearms they carried varied in type and capability, but each weapon represented a choice, a decision point where someone could have stopped and reconsidered. Purchasing a firearm requires paperwork, background checks, waiting periods in some cases. At any point during that process, doubt could have crept in. But it didn't. Or if it did, the group dynamic suppressed it. The commitment to the plan overrode individual hesitation. The radios are perhaps the most chilling detail. Radios indicate coordination, real-time communication, tactical awareness. This wasn't a mob acting on emotion. This was a team executing a strategy. Someone had assigned roles. Someone had established communication protocols. Someone had thought through the logistics of a coordinated assault on a federal facility. And someone had decided that fireworks would provide the perfect cover. The choice of July 4th wasn't coincidental. It was symbolic and tactical. Symbolically, attacking on Independence Day sent a message about their view of American values, about who deserved freedom and who didn't, about their rejection of the current system's legitimacy. Tactically, it was brilliant in its simplicity. On the 4th of July, fireworks are everywhere. The sound of explosions is expected normal, part of the celebration. Guards at the facility would be conditioned to ignore those sounds, to dismiss them as harmless festivities. The attackers understood this. They weaponized normalcy. When the first fireworks detonated near the facility's perimeter, security personnel did exactly what the attackers anticipated. They glanced toward the sound, registered it as holiday celebration, and returned to their duties. The second wave of fireworks drew slightly more attention, but still no alarm. It wasn't until the third sequence, when the explosions seemed too close, too coordinated, too purposeful, that someone realized something was wrong. By then, the attackers were already in position. The psychological state required to execute such an attack is worth examining. These individuals had to suppress fundamental human instincts, the instinct to avoid danger, the instinct to respect authority, the instinct to recognize that their actions would have consequences not just for themselves, but for others. They had to convince themselves that the people working at that facility, the guards and administrators and support staff, were not individuals with families and lives and humanity, but rather cogs in an oppressive machine that deserved to be attacked. This dehumanization is essential to political violence. You cannot easily harm someone you see as fully human, as someone like yourself. But if you can reframe them as oppressors, as agents of injustice, as willing participants in a system you've defined as evil, then violence becomes not just possible but righteous. The documents found in the attacker's possession revealed this psychological transformation. Manifestos, printed articles, handwritten notes, all reinforcing the narrative that ICE facilities were concentration camps, that the people who worked there were complicit in atrocities, that direct action was not just justified but morally required. The language was absolute, apocalyptic, devoid of nuance. There was no acknowledgement that immigration policy involves complex trade-offs, that people can disagree in good faith, that violence might not achieve the desired outcome. In their worldview, there was only oppression and resistance, and they had chosen resistance. Do you think they believed they were heroes? Do you think they saw themselves as freedom fighters, or did some part of them know they had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? The attack itself unfolded with disturbing precision. As fireworks continued to explode, creating confusion and drawing attention away from key areas, the attackers moved toward predetermined positions. They communicated via radio, updating each other on security responses, coordinating their movements, maintaining tactical awareness. This wasn't chaos. This was execution of a plan. The body armor they wore transformed their silhouettes, making them appear larger, more threatening, more militarized. When facility personnel first spotted them, there was a moment of cognitive dissonance, a brief instant where the brain struggled to process what the eyes were seeing. Armed individuals in tactical gear approaching a federal facility on Independence Day, while fireworks exploded overhead. The surrealism of the moment delayed response times by crucial seconds. The attackers had counted on this. They understood that surprise, even brief surprise, creates opportunity. In those first moments of confusion, they advanced closer to the facility than they otherwise could have. They established positions that would have been impossible to reach if security had been fully alert and prepared. But then training took over. Facility personnel, many of them former military or law enforcement, recognized the threat and responded. Alarms sounded. Lockdown protocols activated. Communication with local law enforcement and federal agencies began. The facility transformed from a bureaucratic holding center into a fortress under siege. And the attackers found themselves facing a level of resistance they may not have fully anticipated. This is where ideology meets reality. In the echo chambers where radicalization occurs, the enemy is often portrayed as weak, corrupt, cowardly. The narrative suggests that bold action will expose this weakness, that the system will crumble when confronted with true commitment. But the reality of armed confrontation is different. The people defending that facility were professionals, trained for exactly this scenario, equipped and prepared to respond with overwhelming force. The attackers had brought firearms and body armor. The defenders had those things too, plus reinforcements, plus tactical advantages, plus the full weight of federal law enforcement resources. The psychological impact of this realization, the moment when the attackers understood that their plan was failing, that they were outmatched, that their ideology had led them into a situation from which there was no good exit, must have been profound. Some may have felt fear. Others may have felt betrayal, as if the narrative they'd been sold about the weakness of the system had been a lie. Still, others may have doubled down, convincing themselves that martyrdom was the point, that their sacrifice would inspire others. But whatever they felt, they were trapped. Trapped by their choices, trapped by their ideology, trapped by the consequences of their actions. Law enforcement response was swift and overwhelming. Local police, county sheriffs, state troopers, federal agents all converged on the facility. Helicopters circled overhead. Tactical teams established perimeters. Negotiators attempted to make contact. The small town of Alvarado, accustomed to quiet Independence Day celebrations, found itself at the center of a national news story, a domestic terrorism incident unfolding in real time. For the residents watching from their homes, the cognitive dissonance must have been severe. This was their town. Their safe, predictable, unremarkable town, and now it was a war zone. The fireworks they'd been enjoying suddenly took on sinister meaning. Every explosion made them flinch. Every siren made them wonder if someone they knew was in danger. The attack lasted hours. Not because the attackers were particularly effective, but because law enforcement prioritized containment and de-escalation over immediate confrontation. The goal was to end the situation with minimal casualties, to bring the attackers into custody alive if possible, to preserve evidence and ensure that justice could be served through the legal system rather than through violence. This restraint, this commitment to due process, even in the face of an armed attack, represents something the attackers' ideology couldn't accommodate. They had convinced themselves that the system was irredeemably corrupt, that it operated only through violence and oppression. But the response to their attack demonstrated something different. Professionalism, restraint, a commitment to minimizing harm even when force would have been legally and morally justified. Would you have shown that restraint? If you were a law enforcement officer facing armed attackers who had come to your facility with the intent to harm, could you have maintained the discipline to prioritize de-escalation? As the standoff continued, the psychological pressure on the attackers intensified. They were surrounded, outgunned, with no realistic path to escape or victory. Their radios, which had seemed so tactical and professional during the planning phase, now carried only desperate communications. Their body armor, which had made them feel powerful and protected, now felt heavy and suffocating in the Texas heat. Their firearms, which had symbolized their commitment to direct action, now represented the evidence that would send them to prison for decades. The ideology that had brought them to this moment offered no guidance for what to do next. The online forums and manifestos and radical literature had focused entirely on the righteousness of the cause, on the necessity of action, on the weakness of the enemy. None of it had prepared them for this reality, for the moment when the plan failed and the consequences became unavoidable. Some attackers surrendered relatively quickly once they realized the situation was hopeless. Others held out longer, perhaps hoping for a miracle, perhaps unable to accept that their grand gesture had become a disaster. But eventually, one by one, they gave up. They removed their body armor. They laid down their weapons. They placed their hands on their heads and allowed themselves to be taken into custody. The photographs from that night show individuals who looked nothing like the confident revolutionaries they'd imagined themselves to be. They looked tired, defeated, scared. Young faces marked by the realization that they'd thrown their lives away for an ideology that had promised meaning but delivered only destruction. The investigation that followed revealed the depth of their radicalization. The documents found in their possession weren't just political statements. They were evidence of a psychological journey into extremism, anarchist literature, Antifa organizing materials, anti-government manifestos. Each document represented a step further from mainstream political discourse and deeper into a worldview where violence was not just acceptable but necessary. Psychologists who study radicalization recognize these patterns. The gradual shift in language from reform to revolution. The increasing isolation from people who might offer alternative perspectives. The immersion in communities where extreme views are normalized and celebrated. The development of an us versus them mentality that eliminates moral complexity. The final step where ideology demands action, where thinking about resistance is no longer enough, where only violence can prove commitment to the cause. The Alvarado attackers had completed that journey. And it had led them exactly where such journeys always lead. To violence, to failure, to prison, to lives destroyed. But the story doesn't end with their arrest. Because radicalization isn't just an individual phenomenon, it's a social contagion. For every person who acts on extreme ideology, there are dozens or hundreds who share similar views but haven't yet crossed the line into violence. The Alvarado attack sent ripples through those communities. For some, it served as a warning, a demonstration of the consequences of taking ideology too far. For others, it became a rallying cry, proof that the system would respond with overwhelming force to any challenge. Validation of their belief that the system was irredeemably oppressive. This is the paradox of political violence. It rarely achieves its stated goals. The Alvarado attack didn't shut down the ICE facility. It didn't change immigration policy. It didn't inspire a broader uprising. What it did do was reinforce security measures, justify increased law enforcement presence, and provide ammunition to those who argue that radical political movements are inherently dangerous. The attackers had wanted to strike a blow against what they saw as injustice. Instead, they'd made the situation worse for everyone who shared their concerns about immigration policy. They'd given their opponents a perfect example of why such movements should be feared and suppressed. They'd set back their own cause while destroying their own lives. Do you think they understand that now? Do you think, sitting in federal prison, they've had the psychological reckoning necessary to recognize how thoroughly they were manipulated by an ideology that promised righteousness but delivered only ruin? The psychological aftermath extends beyond the attackers themselves. The facility personnel who were targeted that night, who had to respond to an armed assault while doing their jobs, carry trauma from the experience. The residents of Alvarado, who watched their town become a battlefield, lost something intangible but real, a sense of safety and normalcy. The families of the attackers, who had no idea their loved ones were planning violence, faced their own psychological burden, the guilt and confusion and grief of watching someone they knew become someone they don't recognize. And then there are the detainees inside the facility, the individuals awaiting immigration proceedings who found themselves in the middle of an armed attack supposedly carried out on their behalf. The psychological impact of that experience, of being used as a justification for violence they didn't ask for and didn't want, adds another layer of trauma to an already difficult situation. This is what political violence does. It creates cascading waves of harm that extend far beyond the immediate participants. It traumatizes communities. It polarizes populations. It makes dialogue harder and compromise less likely. It takes complex policy questions and reduces them to tribal conflicts where the only options are total victory or total defeat. The trial of the Alvarado attackers revealed more details about their radicalization. Text messages showing the gradual escalation of rhetoric. Social media posts documenting their immersion in extremist communities. Witness testimony from people who had known them before, who described the changes they'd noticed, the warning signs they'd missed or dismissed. Purchase records for the body armor and weapons. Planning documents outlining the attack strategy. Each piece of evidence told the same story. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a protest that got out of hand. This was premeditated political violence carried out by individuals who had convinced themselves that such violence was not just justified, but necessary. The defense attorneys faced an impossible task. How do you defend clients who were caught in the act, whose planning was documented, whose ideology was explicit? The best they could do was argue for understanding, for recognition that their clients had been radicalized, that they were victims of extremist ideology even as they victimized others through their actions. But the prosecution's case was overwhelming. The evidence was clear, the intent was documented, the actions were undeniable. The jury deliberated briefly before returning guilty verdicts on multiple counts. Conspiracy, assault, on federal officers, weapons charges, domestic terrorism enhancements. The sentences were measured in decades. In the courtroom, as the judge read the sentences, some of the attackers showed emotion, tears, visible distress. The reality of spending the majority of their remaining lives in federal prison, finally breaking through whatever psychological defenses they'd constructed. Others remained stoic, perhaps still clinging to the ideology that had brought them to this moment, perhaps unable to process the magnitude of what they'd done and what it would cost them. Their families wept. Their victims watched with grim satisfaction. The community of Alvarado tried to move forward, to reclaim the normalcy that had been shattered on that Independence Day. But the questions linger. How do we identify radicalization before it becomes violence? How do we intervene in the psychological journey from grievance to extremism? How do we create space for passionate political disagreement without enabling the kind of echo chambers where violence becomes normalized? These aren't easy questions. They require acknowledging that people across the political spectrum are vulnerable to radicalization, that extremism isn't confined to any single ideology, that the psychological patterns that lead to violence are remarkably consistent regardless of the specific beliefs involved. The Alvarado attackers believed they were fighting for justice. They believed the system was so corrupt, so oppressive, so irredeemable that violence was the only option. They believed their actions would inspire others, would strike a blow against tyranny, would be remembered as a brave stand against injustice. They were wrong about all of it. What they actually accomplished was to traumatize a community, destroy their own lives, set back their political cause, and provide a case study in how ideology, when taken to its extreme, becomes indistinguishable from terrorism, regardless of whether it comes from the left or the right. The fireworks that night in Alvarado were supposed to be a diversion, a tactical element in a carefully planned attack. But in retrospect, they serve as a metaphor. Bright, loud, attention-grabbing, but ultimately empty. A flash of light and sound that fades quickly, leaving only smoke and the acrid smell of burnt powder. That's what political violence is. A dramatic gesture that accomplishes nothing except destruction. It doesn't change minds. It doesn't reform systems. It doesn't create the better world its perpetrators claim to seek. It only creates victims, trauma, and a harder, more polarized political landscape where the possibility of actual progress becomes more remote. The individuals who drove toward that ICE facility on July 4, 2025, thought they were revolutionaries. They thought they were heroes. They thought history would vindicate them. Instead, they're federal prisoners serving decades-long sentences for domestic terrorism. Their names are associated not with justice or progress, but with violence and extremism. Their actions didn't shut down the facility or change policy. They just made everything worse. And somewhere in online forums and encrypted chat rooms, other people are having similar conversations, following similar psychological paths, convincing themselves that their grievances justify violence, that their cause is so righteous that extreme action is necessary. The cycle continues. The warning signs are there. The patterns are predictable. But recognizing radicalization and preventing violence requires vigilance, intervention, and a willingness to acknowledge that passionate political belief, when it loses all connection to empathy and pragmatism, can transform ordinary people into attackers. The question isn't whether you agree with someone's politics. The question is whether you can recognize when political passion has crossed the line into dangerous extremism. Can you see the warning signs in people you know? Would you intervene if you noticed someone you cared about sliding down that path? Or would you dismiss it as just passionate belief, just strong convictions, just commitment to a cause? The attackers in Alvarado had friends and family who noticed changes but didn't act, who saw the warning signs but didn't believe their loved ones were capable of violence, who heard the rhetoric but assumed it was just talk. They were wrong. And by the time they realized how wrong they were, it was too late. The attack had happened. The damage was done. The lives were destroyed. That's the final lesson of the Alvarado ICE Facility attack. Radicalization doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in communities, in families, in social networks. And preventing it requires those communities to recognize the warning signs and intervene before ideology becomes violence. Because once that line is crossed, once the plan is executed, once the body armor is strapped on and the weapons are loaded and the attack begins, there's no going back. There's only the aftermath. The trauma, the trials, the sentences, the decades in prison, the lives destroyed, the community scarred, the cause set back. All for a gesture that accomplished nothing except proving that violence, regardless of its ideological justification, is still just violence. And violence, in the end, only creates more victims.